my almost 8 years as Treasurer of the United States, I learned more than I could ever imagine, and it started with this one question. We value what we see every day, but do we see what we value? I spent my entire time in the administration leading the efforts to put the portrait of a woman on our Federal Reserve notes for the first time in U.S. history. And I hope today that I'm going to open your eyes and change your lens, because I realized just how invisible women are in everything we see around us. I am an accidental feminist. I am also an accidental historian and an accidental educator, and I'm going to take you through my journey, starting with my time on the Treasury Federal Reserve Transition Team in the fall of 2008, at the height of the financial crisis. This is one of my favorite photos. It is a 1913 suffrage pageant on the steps of Treasury. What I love about this photo is, if you look to the right, that is my office, the 6 windows from the corner. So I walked up these steps every day as a reminder of those who came before me. This is a rendering from 1879, one of the earliest images that we have of women in Treasury. It's in the Treasury workroom. And it's interesting because women were actually master counterfeit detectors. But for the most part, they were maintenance staff and very, very hard labor on the production process. What I found so interesting in my experience at Treasury is what I came across at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in the Historic Resource Center. So the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, or the BEP, is where we produced our nation's currency. But it's also where we produced all the financial products in the US government, everything from savings bonds to military payment certificates, food stamps, postage stamps. And so I found the Historic Resource Center and wanted to go through and look at some of the images and renderings that I came across, and it was just beautiful artistry. And what I found very, very quickly was that every image that I came across of a woman was an allegorical woman. It wasn't a real woman. There were these types of images, kind of Lady Liberties, women in togas and sometimes no togas. But every image that I came across of a man was a real man, a founding father, a cabinet member, a president. And I thought to myself, well, if you think about the purpose of currency, it's not just to facilitate commerce, it's also to institutionalize our history, right? So on every denomination of coin and currency, you're always going to find a very important person on the front and a very historic monument or edifice on the back. So I dug around a little deeper and found out that we've never had a woman as a portrait on our notes. And why was that? Because there were dozens of other countries at the time who were doing that. So I reached out to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing Director, Larry Felix, who was my partner on this very covert project, and his senior staff, and I asked them the question, why haven't we ever done this before? And I asked them individually, and they had the same answer, which is, no one's ever brought it up. Well, I thought that was interesting, and I knew I found my new life's mission. It's like Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, this was my purpose in life. So after the Treasury Federal Reserve Transition Team, I was one of the few people who was offered a Senate-confirmed position in the administration. It was a big decision for me to make. My daughter was 8 at the time. My son was 12. We were living in California. But I knew I had to do this to plant the seeds for what I knew was going to be a much larger conversation. So when I was offered the position, I submitted a proposal to my boss, Secretary Geithner, and Chief of Staff Mark Patterson, and I cobbled together the portfolio that I have, which was overseeing the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the U.S. Mint. I wanted to be a senior advisor to the Secretary. I was part of the senior staff that met with the Secretary every morning, and I became the chair of the Advanced Counterfeit Deterrence Steering Committee, all for the purpose of working on this project that no one knew I was going to be working on, except for my very, very small team, because I knew I wanted to make a difference. And I also had to find my opportunities along the way, because I knew this was going to be a very, very long process. You can't change hundreds of years of history overnight. So I came across this one opportunity to kind of be a litmus test. I went to Secretary Geithner and I told him that I wanted to do a convening in Treasury to honor the 30th anniversary of Women's History Month. And so in March of 2010, we had our first Women in Finance Symposium. It was the senior women in the administration And it was also women from the private sector talking about the financial crisis and the path moving forward. And lo and behold, the following May, it became the cover of Time magazine, where the very first paragraph, they talked about this symposium and the new economic decision makers in one of the most consequential times of our economic history. I knew I was onto something. But I also knew that there was something else about Tim that was very unique. When I was briefing him about this particular event the Friday before, he stops in the middle and he says, "You know, my daughter is visiting this weekend. I wonder if I can get her to change her flight so she can stay for this event on Monday." I knew I was onto something. Because I'm pretty sure that Tim was looking at his daughter the same way I looked at my daughter. My daughter Brooke is 16 years old. There's nothing that she can't accomplish. And so, you know, it's funny, my son's a sophomore at Harvard, and I tease him all the time. I say, "Joey, if you work really, really hard, maybe someday you could be Brookie's vice president." It's true. And of course, if you knew Brookie, Joey's response is absolutely yes, of course. Because we know that our daughters are capable of anything, right? And but they need inspirations in order to have aspirations. And so the purpose of seeing yourself on currency or seeing yourself in the public domain is because you know that you can be a future history maker. And this really wasn't just about women for the sake of women on currency. Every generation of currency has a theme. My recommendation for this generation of currency was democracy. If you look back, even during the time of the financial crisis, technology really turned our world upside down. And the advent of the mass-scale use of social media really provided a voice to the voiceless. And even during that time, right, we had all these movements happen. We had the Occupy movement, the Tea Party movement, and even overseas with the Arab Spring. So for me, that is democracy. So I made sure when I made this presentation to Secretary Geithner in October of 2012, I was following this path of traditional currency design, but was able to do it with a very deliberate purpose of this theme. And knowing we were working on a time frame for 2020, that was our timeline, 2020 happens to be the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. So giving half your population the ability to participate in our governance process, they happen to be women. That's how this happened. And so when I made that presentation to Secretary Geithner, he says, "This is cool, we should do this." So we embarked on our public engagement process to solicit feedback from the American public on who should be considered for our currency. And the only criteria, by the way, in order to be an American on our currency is you have to be deceased. And by law, it is the Secretary of the Treasury who has the final authority, not the President and not Congress. So I met with thousands of people all over the country in town halls and roundtables, and I learned three very specific things. One, there's a lot of hate in this world. There's a lot of people who don't want change. I'll call them preservationists. And some of them were in my inner circle. Two, how little people knew about American history. And three, how less they knew about women in our American history. So along the way, I created this database. My team and I created this database of this feedback. I didn't want this to be about one woman or 10 women, but the hundreds of women who were overlooked in our history. And for me, I was really, really disappointed when it became politicized. This was never supposed to be about the $10 bill versus the $20 bill, or Alexander Hamilton versus Andrew Jackson, but a conversation about the contributions of this extraordinary group of women who made our country great. And so I made sure that when we made this announcement of our currency design in April of 2016, that database was also posted on our website. But something else happened, something pretty extraordinary. In the summer of 2015, I received an email from my high school history teacher. True story, Mr. Wilder. He's still there, by the way, teaching American history. And he had just seen my CNN video, and he wanted to congratulate me, but he also wanted to thank me, because he said on that day, August 17, 2015, he walked into his classroom for the very first time, and after 35 years of teaching American history, realized that there are no images of women on his walls. And he wanted to change it, and he did. He invited me back that fall. I walked into that same classroom. I took this class over 30 years ago, and there on the walls were Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman, and me. It was very surreal. It was. But it dawned on me, if one teacher or 100 teachers or 1,000 teachers did the same thing, can you imagine what that would do for our girls and our boys? Right? It's a play on unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is when you don't realize that you're being influenced by something that you're exposed to. Could it be that you might be influenced by something you're not exposed to? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And so when I left the administration early in July of last summer, I decided to launch Teachers Writing History, RIGHT, on August 26th, 2016, which is Equality Day. So my high school was the pilot program. Mr. Wilder and the vice principal, Katie Teakle, took this database that we created, and they added the public images, and they integrated it into their classroom. It's very, very simple. You can see it. It's last name, first name, date of birth, date of death, a summary that our historians put together, and then they added the public images. But it's amazing what happens when you give simple content to students and let them run with it. They did everything in addition to images. They did performance pieces, flashcards, etc., technology. It's what I call inspired learning. It's amazing what happens with these students. And it took off. In fact, thank you to Mr. Wilder. I received an email from the superintendent of the New Haven Unified School District asking me to come to their school board meeting because they placed a resolution on their agenda to encourage all their schools to participate in Teachers Writing History. And what was really fascinating is it resonated as much with boys as it was as girls. I remember receiving this email from this young male from the Keene schools, a copy of an email that he sent to his headmaster and wanting to participate in Teachers Writing History. And he said in this email to his headmaster, "This is not a feminist interest. This is an American interest of retelling the stories of these unsung heroes." That's exactly right. This isn't his story or her story. This is our story. It's actually not gender-centric. It's gender-neutral. This is just people. These are people talking about people. And if you think about it, I think the reason why it resonated so well with boys and girls, I mean, if we think we have it hard as women today, can you imagine what it was like 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, right? Against all odds. If you're going to be a woman and make a dent in history, it's going to be under extraordinary circumstances. So these are just, very dramatic and a lot of intrigue, and people just were interested. And for me, it wasn't just getting beyond, currency or education or leadership positions like you saw in the Time magazine article. There was a much bigger conversation that I felt we needed to have. And this isn't just about kind of pounding my fist and doing something for the sake of women. There's science that actually shows that if we don't do something different, that our children will be harmed. Science magazine, just this last January, published this article called Gender Stereotypes and Intellectual Ability. And the premise is this: gendered notions of brilliance are acquired early and have an immediate effect on children's interest. Here's what it says: 6-year-old girls are less likely than boys to think their gender is really, really smart. 6-year-old girls avoid activities where you have to be really, really smart. And as young as the most rapid changes happen between 5 and 7 years old. Why? School. That's when they start school. So as much as we think we can protect them at home, once they get into the classroom, whether it's the teachers, whether it's their peers, whether it's something they're not seeing on their walls, their confidence is affected. And it makes a difference, not just for girls, but for boys as well. So for me, I'm trying to get beyond what this means in terms of this being called a feminist issue. This is an equity issue. These are our daughters, these are our sisters, these are our nieces, these are our granddaughters. If they lose, we all lose. But there is hope. There is hope. There's a lot of great activity going on. I want to start by showing you some of the things that I'm going to do and a lot of people are going to do moving forward. So statues, what I call writing history. Statues, great, great story. Central Park. Central Park, one of the most visited parks in the world, over 40 million visitors a year. There are 23 statues in Central Park. Can you name the female statues? Mother Goose. True. And Alice in Wonderland. These are fantasy characters, but you will find the great conquistadors on their horses, Jose Marti, Simon Bolivar. I'm not the first person to bring this up. There are many great champions out there. Colleen Jenkins, Pan Elam, been doing great work. But I started talking about this when I left the administration last summer. I was talking about currency and leadership and education, and I mentioned statues and mentioned the example of Central Park. This woman came up to me and she says, I'm from New York Life. I've never heard it talked about in the context that you just said. Can you come meet with our foundation? They need to hear what you're saying. So I did. Fast forward to a month ago. I was the closing speaker for New York Life's announcement about their contribution for the first ever statue of a female in Central Park. It's huge. It's a great story. Heather Nestle, the head of the foundation, went to the CEO, Ted Mathis, and said, I want to contribute $300,000 for this effort. And Ted Elam said, no, we're giving $500,000. But it makes a difference because it becomes that tipping point. It causes that larger conversation because in D.C., the nation's capital, where millions of people come from all over the world to learn about our history and what we value and whom we value, we have 2 female statues in the outdoors in the public domain. We have Eleanor Roosevelt at her husband's memorial. We have Mary McLeod Bethune in Southeast in Lincoln Park, which very few people know about. And there's so many more other examples, Congressional Gold Medals and Women's History Museum. My goal is to have all of this underway or completed by August 26, 2020, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. We need that milestone to work backwards from. That's 3.5 years to show what we've done for the last 100. And it's not just what you physically see, it's also women in leadership positions. If we flatline at 20% for women on corporate boards in the S&P 500, or flatline for women at 20% membership in Congress, we have a lot of work ahead of us. So, I am a feminist, not because I'm a woman, but because I have a daughter, and anything is possible for her. And true feminism was something that my mom exhibited growing up, and raising all 9 of us as a single parent and sending all of us to college. So it is time for deeds, not words. Open your eyes, look around, and see what you don't see, and change it. This is a whole new discussion, a call to action, one leader at a time. Be that leader and reinvent visibility. Thank you.